It's truly a pleasure to be here with all of you, and Mona did a really great job of getting us a bit more centered into ourselves. But before I dive into my talk, what I would love to do is have us feeling a bit more unified and connected in this experience. So I'd love you to look to your left, look to your right, and say hey to your neighbors, especially the ones that you don't know. Just like, hey, how you doing? What do you think they do for a living? What do you think they do for a job? Just create a mental profile in your mind. And as we carry on with the next part, I'm going to put the focus more on each and every one of you. So if you're comfortable, please raise your hand if any of the following applies to you. Please raise your hand if you identify as a person of color. Hey, thank you for sharing. Please raise your hand if you identify as part of the LGBTQ+ community. Awesome, thank you for sharing. Please raise your hand if you are someone who grew up in a single-parent household. Okay. Please raise your hand if you're currently a migrant in the country that you reside in. And lastly, please raise your hand if you are neurodiverse. Awesome. Now thinking back to that little profile that you made in your mind, were there any assumptions that you got correct? Or potentially any similarities or differences between you and your neighbor that actually shocked you? Typically, I like to kick off these kind of conversations with an exercise like this because it really helps us to start thinking beyond ourselves in these moments and start thinking about the others around us, who they are. There's more to each and every one of us than what meets the eye. And for me personally, I've always found it quite interesting when people get to know me on a deeper level. So today, I'm standing here before all of you, and you see a young Black woman, potentially in her 20s or 30s. I'm hoping you're thinking 20s. Yeah. And since I'm standing up here in front of all of you, you're probably assuming I have some sort of a higher education degree. But with that, what you can't see is that I did grow up in a single-parent household. And although I have this very strong accent and I grew up in the country, I'm not American. I'm actually an immigrant there. And even at some point in my life, I would have been classified as an illegal immigrant. And so each and every one of us in this room, we have these intricate webs of our identities and our backgrounds that truly make us who we are. And in some cases, they can act as a wall that keeps us from being able to connect with one another and also being able to access opportunities. And unfortunately, sometimes locked into the circumstances that we're in. So for me, I kind of serendipitously fell into this topic way back in 2020. And the topic is DEI. So intersectionality. You've all just gotten a quick crash course into the term intersectionality. And it's a term coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, and it's essentially saying that our identities and social categorizations such as race, gender, sexuality, and so on and so forth, they intersect and interact in such complex ways that it creates unique experiences of discrimination on sometimes advantages, but oftentimes more hurdles than what meets the eyes. And so, for me, like I said, I serendipitously fell into this topic back in 2020. I was doing my master's in entrepreneurship. I was dabbling with my own business idea, and I kept hearing this term, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and y'all, it was all the hype in the entrepreneurship ecosystem. Like, we kept seeing a plethora of programs coming up to support people from underrepresented backgrounds. So there were programs for female founders, migrant founders, Black founders, Flinta founders, you name it, there was a program for it. But there was something that shocked me at this time, and it was this number, 3%. As it turns out, between 2018 to 2022, funding for women-led startups in Europe had dropped from 3% to 1%. And I was like, what? How's this possible? So I looked at this at a larger scale and on a global level, and it actually turned out that 2% or less of venture capital funding was going to women-led teams. And then when I looked at it from an ethnicity perspective, it wasn't looking much better. So when I looked into a country like the US, where people actually keep stats on ethnicity, what we were seeing is just 2% or less of that funding was going to Black entrepreneurs. So for me, I was like, okay, this is weird. Because we have a plethora of programs, and yet when we look at the statistics, nothing is changing. And so this was the catalyst for kickstarting my research journey, which started off as my master's thesis and quickly turned into really outstanding collaborations with amazing organizations. And my research was particularly focused on female minority founders, and there were 3 core issues that came out. The first issue, one size does not fit all. So when we were looking at these programs, it was incredibly evident that founders were being grouped together based off of a unifying characteristic. Female founders, migrant founders, or some other single demographic factor. But as it turns out, this was actually missing the opportunity to take a holistic view and actually address the mutually reinforcing nature of inequities that these founders were facing. So, as a result, it ended up leading to further marginalization, which an interview participant candidly shared with me in her experience by saying, being a Black woman, being queer, and being from a working class background, I get frustrated when there's so much about female empowerment, but they're all white. Now it feels like there's a women's club, and I'm still not included. And the issue here was not that she was Black, and it was not that she was women. It was the culmination of all of these intersectionalities coming together that was making it hard for her to connect with the others in the program, for others in the program to connect to her, and it oftentimes left her feeling isolated in her challenges because these programs and initiatives were not fully able to address them. And this isn't a surprising phenomenon that just came out of my research. So we actually see this in a lot of other contexts, for example, within the feminist movement. And also, when we were looking at the research, what we were realizing was that these initiatives were not addressing the larger ecosystem problem of bias, prejudice, and discrimination. And another founder was open enough to share her experience with investor bias as follows. He walked in and started handing out business cards. He didn't even give me a business card, but then the second I started talking, he realized, oh, she's the boss. And time again, that's the issue. And it's this bias and prejudice which actually culminates into the second problem that came out in the research, which is an oxymoron that I like to call over-under representation. Because through these initiatives, it was great. These founders were being seen more than ever before. They were more prominent. You could see them everywhere. However, the overrepresentation of these underrepresented founders was actually having adverse consequences. Another founder candidly expressed it in this way. Yes, we're being seen, but in terms of getting funding or actually, having a seat at the table, it's still non-existent. Like our faces may be on billboards, but I'm still not getting paid. And all of these issues culminated into the third core problem that came out in the research, actually this was also not solely something that came from the interview participants. So when I was looking into other research reports, it was actually found by a report conducted by Morgan Stanley that 80% of investors believe that women and minority-owned businesses receive just the right amount of funding or more funding than they deserve. Let that sink in. Because if I went and looked back at the data again, and the most recent stats from 2023, this is very far from the case. Because once again, we see this number, 3%. In 2023, only 3% of the investments in Europe went to women-founded startups. So clearly this was very far from the case, and all of this prejudice, bias, overrepresentation of underrepresented founders were culminating into the third core problem that came out in the research, which is diversity washing. And diversity washing, much like greenwashing, is when individuals and organizations superficially engage with DEI initiatives, and then they don't actually follow through with them with meaningful actions, commitment, or progress. And for many of the people and initiatives that did create these initiatives and participate in them, it was great. It improved their branding, it helped them to avoid criticism during tense times, and to an extent, they did do some good, yeah? But when we actually looked at it at a grander scale, most of these initiatives failed. And they failed because they did not implement effective strategies, they did not apply an intersectional lens to understand the challenges of these founders, and most of all, they failed to get key stakeholder buy-in. So as a result, we're seeing a lot of this now. Today, we're seeing a ton of organizations, and this isn't just applicable to the entrepreneurial context, this is the wider tech scene as a whole. Major organizations are actually pulling back on their DEI pledges or pretending like they never really made them at all. And so now we're seeing the ecosystem actually go backwards. And it's a shame, really, it's a shame. But it's also not surprising for the founders that I've interviewed, and also it's not deterring them. So the beautiful thing is that since 2019, we're actually seeing a significant yet steady increase in the amount of women-started businesses. The same goes for people of color, and in particular, women of color, who in some regions are accounting for 50% of the new businesses started in the regions. So, of course, we're seeing these founders ushering a new era of entrepreneurship, pushing to persevere and redefine what entrepreneurship means. And it's also very much like a lot of the experiences that many of us have, because we all have our own intersectionalities as a whole. And this is why we have to look past these walls, and to be able to create a change, it starts with all of you. It starts with taking the time to go beyond the first impression, say, hey, how you doing? And then piece by piece, we're able to then reveal that we don't have to go through these problems alone, and it's not an us versus them, but in actuality, it's us versus these problems. And together, we're able to then usher in more diversity, encourage more inclusion, and inevitably foster in an era of more equity for all. And so, with that being said, I'm happy to say thank you for listening to my TED Talk.